What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so getting into Supergirl Rebirth, this is an interesting scenario in DC Comics, and the reason why I say that is because, from what I've been able to gather, historically speaking anyway, a lot of like the DC movies and shows and so on have kind of like derived their content from the comics. For example, the Flash TV show derives a lot of its stuff from the comics, the New 52 run, the Wonder Woman movie pulled a lot of its stuff from a combination of like the New 52 Wonder Woman, and even, so far as like DC bombshells in a lot of ways. But Supergirl is kind of a unique situation because Supergirl really derives a lot of its content from the show in the sense of like how she's depicted and how she's done. Now, this is one of those scenarios where the two kind of work in tandem in order to restore Supergirl to the legacy that she had upheld for so long. And the reason why I say that is because of the fact that Supergirl, when she was first introduced into DC Comics, was very much a character that was part Superman and then something a little bit more. Of course, Superman kind of stands on his own two legs just because of the legacy that he created. So it's one of those things where it's like Superman is what he is, and there's really no working around that, just kind of how things work with his character. But with Supergirl, DC had to find a way to make her interesting while simultaneously making sure that she was her own character. And so what they ended up doing is they actually ended up kind of having her embody this example of like a little bit of innocence, like one part innocence, one part hope, and then one part just raw power. And that's really what she was when it went into like Crisis on Infinite Earths, for example. She was like the last member of the super family that was left to fight the Anti-Monitor and was the only one that could damage him. The problem with this was that going into the post-crisis landscape, Supergirl in the form of Kara Zor-El was gone. I mean, she was eliminated. And the reason for that was because of the fact that after Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC wanted to restore the Superman mantle as Superman basically being the last survivor of Krypton. And with Supergirl being there, it didn't allow for that. So they basically got rid of her, then they just kind of invoked this weird, like cyborg kind of, I don't know, some weird situation with Supergirl. It wasn't very interesting. But in like 1993, after 0 Hour Crisis in Time, DC brought her back. The problem was that when they rebooted in 2011 with the New 52, people hated Supergirl because Supergirl, again, was supposed to be this sort of innocent meets power meets hope kind of character, kind of this perfect embodiment of Superman and a little bit more. But she wasn't any of that. She was just like this angsty teenage girl that like didn't know her place in the world. No one understands me, and all that kind of nonsense. And people hated it. People just didn't like it at all. And so because of that, she was literally just kind of shuffled around from one story to the next. And DC tried their best to make her interesting, but nothing really worked. She routinely stayed one of their lowest selling titles. And so with DC Rebirth, what they did is they went back and they said, okay, let's reinvigorate Supergirl. She's really popular when it comes to the show. And so we basically want to give people a measure of familiarity. And they can do that with her character, especially with the character of Cat Grant, just because of the fact that she's not wildly significant by any standard of measurement. But with DC Rebirth, the way it's done here, or at least with Supergirl Rebirth, remember, we'd covered this already, so the whole Supergirl Rebirth story, the one shot that we were given. But of course, following the events of Superman Doomed and all that kind of stuff, the atmosphere was basically sort of irradiated with, kryptonite, more or less. And what this did is it put, Supergirl in a circumstance where she was on the verge of losing her powers. And so what they did in Supergirl Rebirth is they basically invoked the DEO, the Department of External Operations. And this group goes back to like 1998. They're not super old, but they have their own little bit of history. They have a good chunk of time in terms of, their appearances in DC Comics and the role they play. But they basically exist to just kind of like monitor superhero threats around the world and make sure they don't become a threat to society at large. But at the same time, they also looked at the idea of Supergirl and said, yeah, we can make sure she doesn't become a threat, but she can also be an asset too. She's somebody that we can use for our own ends. I mean, it's not like, the Suicide Squad under Amanda Waller, but it is the idea that she can basically help to curb superhero threats because it's like the DEO having their own little Superman. And so because of that, Supergirl's powers were restored by the DEO, but under the idea that she's going to effectively work for them. Now, again, this all worked out just because of the fact that she was basically adopted by a couple agents for the DEO, and they effectively became her parents, and they do the best they can to raise her. And that's really the nature of this, in the sense that Cat Grant's kind of rolled back in the traditional landscape, which is to say that she's gone back to being kind of arrogant, full of hubris, different things like that. Because in the New 52, again, she was a little younger. She wasn't necessarily as arrogant as she is now, but this was really designed to kind of bring her closer to the TV show counterpart, as opposed to kind of making her own character. Now, once the TV show starts to drop off in popularity, assuming that it ever does, then what DC will probably do is they'll probably bring her more back in line with her post-crisis iteration, which means she'll probably have a son named Adam, different things like that. They'll bring him back and all that kind of good stuff. But the fact remains here, this really emphasizes the idea that Supergirl just doesn't quite feel at home. And that's one of the reasons why I kind of look at the story and say, this is what the New 52 should have been. Because in the New 52, she was angry at the world because she didn't have a home. You know, it wasn't like Superman where he had lived on Earth for 20 some odd years and, you know, grew acclimated to Earth itself, you know, and then eventually became Superman, basically formed a life for himself. For Supergirl, she is technically older than Superman is. And so, you know, while he arrived on Earth as a baby, she was just kind of floating out in space in stasis for a decade or two, so that when she arrived on Earth, she was younger than he was. But it's one of those weird situations. But she's not acclimated to life on Earth. She's not used to it. She hasn't grown up as a little baby with a family. I mean, for all intents and purposes, Superman might as well be human due to the fact that he was discovered as an infant and raised by the Kents. With Supergirl, she showed up here when she was already, you know, in her teenage years, more or less. And so because of that, she's at that point now where she's trying to figure out her place in the world. She's trying to understand what she's about. Being on a planet that's not her own complicates those things. In addition to this, it's also the idea of rolling in these agents of the DEO trying to be her parents, and they're kind of stuck in a situation that they're not normally used to. And again, this is designed to mimic the nature of parents because, you know, under normal circumstances, people, you know, normal human beings, they pop out a kid and there's no guidebook on how to raise that kid. There's no guidebook on what you're supposed to do, on how you're supposed to take care of that child. Not by any standard of measurement. You just take it day by day and do the best you can. Much like this circumstance, they're agents. They don't have kids. They've never been in a situation like this. You know, for them, it initially started out as a job. It started out as a chore. You know, look, your assignment is to raise this girl. But the longer time went on, the more they started to view her as a daughter. And so because of this, they do the best they can in trying to get things together. But at the end of the day, they still somewhat struggle. Now, of course, this coincides with the idea of Supergirl basically taking off to the Fortress of Solitude, just because of the fact that, remember, the New 52 Superman gave her the key to the Fortress of Solitude and said, this will be your home away from home. If the world becomes too chaotic, if the world becomes too much for you to bear, then this can be a place where you can come to find some small measure of peace, where you can sort of let your mind be at ease and try to get back in touch with some aspect of Krypton. Now, of course, this was kind of an experience that the New 52 Superman was passing on to her because it's the same thing he did. The classic Superman that we see now in DC Rebirth is the same thing that he did in the classic Superman stories. So again, it works very well for her. The problem with this is that as soon as she comes back, she's met with Cyborg Superman. Now, here's the funny thing about this. This is not Hank Henshaw Cyborg Superman. And that's kind of the weird situation because in the New 52, DC kind of danced around it, right? Like Hank Henshaw Cyborg Superman was nowhere to be found in the New 52. And so when a Cyborg Superman popped up in Supergirl stories as part of the New 52, DC was like, well, maybe it's Cyborg Superman, maybe it's not. I mean, I don't know, maybe it is, you know, we'll just kind of see how it goes. That's the game that they were playing. That's the problem that they were playing. I mean, he was never officially referred to by name. It was just the Cyborg Superman. Now, of course, his story unfolded where it was basically learned that he was created by Brainiac. But the problem was that his plot point was never fully resolved. He was just sort of there, and then he fought Supergirl for a little while, and then he was gone. And it was just because of the fact that DC was literally flying by the seat of their pants when it came to the Supergirl character. And now what this does is it basically wraps that up, and it actually does it pretty well. But I would go as far as to say that this turns out to be someone who's not Hank Henshaw just because of the fact of what's going on in Superman. With regards to, you know, classic Superman being restored in DC Rebirth sort of coming back, is a chance for DC to kind of beef up the classic Superman roster. General Zod, Doomsday, the original Cyborg Superman, Hank Henshaw, the return of the Eradicator, different things like that. If DC is going with that direction, then it makes sense because regardless of what Supergirl fans will say, Superman is the face of DC Comics. I mean, that's just the way it is. There's no arguing that. That's just how it goes. Because of that, Supergirl's always going to play second fiddle. She's always going to get, you know, more or less the hand-me-downs. Now, it doesn't mean that she can't have her own rogues gallery, that she can't have her own stories. Definitely, and this is a really strong direction in making her her own character, as it should be. But it makes sense that if DC is bringing back Hank Henshaw Cyborg Superman, as we know they are, they can't then turn around and throw Cyborg Superman in Supergirl stories without fleshing him out in the Superman stories first. So again, it's one of those things that just kind of comes together and just sort of makes sense. And so again, this wraps up this loose plot thread pretty fast. Now, the other half of this is building in the idea of Cat Grant, you know, kind of bringing her character more into the fold, having her play more of a role in the life of Kara Zor-El. Again, kind of establishing this idea that Cat Grant had spotted Kara Zor-El during a seminar in school, really kind of educates her in the idea of, hey, look, if you want to get ahead in the world, you got to be willing to cut some throats. But it's also this idea of Kara Zor-El just not quite being content, not quite being happy. And that's the core of the story, the fact that she just kind of feels out of place. Now, this this is one of the reasons why the idea of Supergirl always resonated with her fan base, because Kara Zor-El, at least the classic Kara Zor-El, you really kind of grew with her as she grew. For example, she was first introduced, and then she was basically a backup feature, in Superman stories. It wasn't until some 10 years after her original appearance that she got her own stories within Adventure Comics, and even then it wasn't really called Supergirl, it was just Adventure Comics, and it had Supergirl. DC had a slow build. They took time building her character up, but over that 10-year window, fans grew with Supergirl, so that by the time she got her own solo series, it was tantamount to them being 18 years old, getting out, getting their own job, getting their own apartment. They basically kind of stepped into the game of life at the same time that she did. And so because of that, this follows a lot of the same trend in the sense that she's still trying to figure out her place in the world. She's trying to understand where it is that she's going. At the same time, she's really sort of told by Cyborg Superman, look, I've recreated Argo City. Argo City exists out there. You want to go home. You do not view Earth as your home. You do not view Earth as a place that you belong. And so because of this, she's tempted to go investigate things, to go check things out, to go see what's going on. And when she arrives, she finds Argo City has been reconstructed by Cyborg Superman, of course, who declared himself to be Zor-El, to be her father. And so again, this is kind of cool because what this does is it basically gives a purpose and it gives a name to this, Cyborg Superman, to Zor-El. And so that's kind of the cool thing here, is because it gives her her own villain, her own version of Cyborg Superman, so to speak. Instead of this guy just kind of being a faceless, nameless villain that she's facing off against that may or may not be Hank Henshaw, depending on how you want to look at it, now he's his own guy. Now he's his own villain. Now he's Supergirl's villain. And so again, this is building up the Supergirl roster. It's building up the Supergirl landscape. It's giving Supergirl fans a reason to say, this is why this character is wholly your own. The other half of this is really the idea of growing the coming of age story, that just because you want something doesn't mean you're going to get it the way you want it. And that's kind of the funny thing here, is because she sort of built up this image in her mind of what she wants Argo City to be, of how she imagines Argo City coming back, that it's going to be exactly the way she remembered it. But much like life, just because you remember something a certain way doesn't mean it was that way. And that's the struggle that Kara Zor-El is dealing with. Now, this manifests itself not so much literally in the sense that Zor-El has reconstructed Argo City and used the technology of Brainiac to reconstruct all the citizens of Argo City, albeit in the form of cyborgs. And the reason why this matters is because of the fact that Kara Zor-El's mother had followed her to Argo City as part of a joint venture between the two to basically explore Argo City and to see what's going on, if for no other reason than the fact that Eliza can basically look around and see what Supergirl was talking about when she says she wants to go home. She wants to go back to the way things were, kind of makes her a better mom and that sort of situation. The problem with this is that what Cyborg Superman has done is in going through and recreating, kind of creating these cyborg versions of the people of Argo City, he kind of needs like a spark of life, so to speak, if that makes sense. And that's not a new thing, right? That's something that routinely happens in comic books. For example, with the character of like Madeline Pryor. Back in the old X-Men comics, you had Jean Grey and you had Cyclops. Eventually, Jean Grey became a Phoenix. She ultimately ended up, sacrificing her life. But while all that was happening, the villain Mr. Sinister came to the realization that if Scott Summers and Jean Grey ever had a kid, that kid would effectively be God just because of all the power that it would possess. And so because he couldn't take Jean Grey proper, he basically cloned her. And so when Jean Grey kind of, sacrificed her life as the Phoenix Force, so to speak, it granted a spark of life in the body of Madeline Pryor, bringing her to life. Now, of course, she was basically discarded by Mr. Sinister because she didn't have any of the powers that Jean Grey had. But the fact remains, that's the kind of thing that we see when we talk about, a shell getting a spark of life. It's really just kind of taking the essence of another being and putting it in somebody else. Now, with what it is that Zor-El is doing here, it's a lot more literal in the sense that it's not like, it's the essence of that person. What he's doing is quite literally draining life away from people. He's starting with Eliza and kind of taking the life force of who she is and throwing that in the body of Supergirl's mother. Now, of course, what this does is it basically brings Supergirl's mother back, or at least it gives the cyborg version some life, but she's got all the memories that she had before. The problem with this is that she's just as much a slave as she is the actual mother of Supergirl, in the sense that she has programming, and it's really difficult for her to override her programming. And so what ends up happening here is that where Supergirl's taken prisoner by her father immediately launches an attack on the planet Earth for the purpose of taking humanity, draining the life force out of them, and then putting that life force in those individuals who are cyborgs, thereby returning Argo City back to the way it's supposed to be. Now, this is kind of interesting, and the reason why is because it'd be very easy for us to look at the character of Zor-El and say, yeah, man, that guy's a villain, that guy's a bad guy, but not necessarily. The guy's doing some pretty unsavory things, but if all we were looking at was actions to determine who's a bad guy and who's a good guy, things would be vastly different. But if we look at the idea of intention, his intention is just to bring his people back. His intention is to restore his city to the way that it's supposed to be. It almost falls in line with what it is that Supergirl wants. He's giving her the wish that she wants. That's one of the things that he says is, look, in the time that I've been around here, I've heard you talking to yourself. I've heard you talk about how this just isn't your home, how you want Argo City back. I've heard other people talk about you, about how there's something weird about you, or how you're an alien, those who know who you are. You know, I'm giving you your heart's desire. I'm giving you back Argo City. And it's one of those things where Supergirl kind of looks at it and says, yeah, I want it back, but not like this. You know, I want Argo City back the way I envision it, not the way that I'm kind of stuck with. And again, this is kind of a reflection of the real world versus the world that we imagine it to be. It's one of these coming of age kind of things where you basically learn, look, not everything is the way that you want it to be, and you just got to learn to deal with it. And so again, it's kind of cool here. The other half of this is that, again, this really hits home at the idea of, look, Supergirl's got to win, right? Like, the day's got to be saved. I mean, it wouldn't be a superhero story if she didn't come out on top. And so, of course, you know, trying to reason with her mother saying, look, you know, if you have any memory of who you used to be, then you've got to be able to look around at your husband, look around at Zor-El, and realize this is all wrong. This is not the way things are supposed to be. And so ultimately, of course, her mother basically betrays her programming, at least for a fraction of a second, and restores life back to Eliza, and then sacrifices herself in the process. And so in doing so, what ends up happening is Kara Zor-El actually hits up on a homing signal that's being generated by Zor-El himself. And this electrical signal is really more of like a frequency, like a radio wave, and it's what this containment cell uses in order to basically keep her contained. And so much like creating a key to a door, she's able to basically break herself out. Now, of course, this results in kind of like cellular manipulation with regards to the containment cell, in the sense that they're all basically like, you know, nano cells, electrical cells, and she's basically able to tap into their frequency and then weaken them, you know, kind of break them apart and then free herself in the process. But what it does is it gives her a genius idea, because back on Earth, all hell is breaking loose. Now, of course, this kind of begs the question, why isn't like Superman or the Justice League or somebody else like that, you know, getting involved? I couldn't say for any measure of certainty, but to hazard a guess, I would say that if the Justice League got involved or Superman got involved and saved the day in the inaugural story of Supergirl, it would immediately diminish the capabilities of her as a character. And the goal of DC, you know, with regards to the Supergirl title, isn't to make a story called Supergirl and the people who save her life. It's Supergirl. So it's just designed to focus on her and what it is that she's capable of doing. And so she's able to save the day for the most part, in the sense that she's, you know, able to fight off, you know, against Zor-El, save a few people in the process. But the genius of her plan comes into play when she hits up with Cat Grant as well as the DEO. And the reason why is because of the fact that the DEO has the technology that she needs in order to initiate a signal that will interfere with the, you know, radio signal, so to speak, that Zor-El is using to control the various robots that he has that are going around grabbing people, kidnapping them, so on and so forth. But Cat Grant was a former gossip columnist. And so because of that, she has a lot of connections with regards to radio stations, news companies, so on and so forth. And so it would allow her to actually broadcast the signal. And so it's really one of these things that kind of works in tandem. But this is, again, sort of building up the community of Supergirl, basically saying, look, she's got a lot of resources at her disposal, and it all really comes out to help benefit her at the end of the day, which of course she's successful in using when it comes to sending out this signal, disrupting Zor-El himself, cutting him off from all the other cyborgs that are out there, and then basically using this signal to incapacitate him. But again, if this were a Superman story, I would dare say he would just beat the absolute crap out of Zor-El. And that's kind of what we would expect, is for him to just fight and fight and fight and fight. But with Supergirl, it's a little bit different. You know, what she lacks in strength in comparison to her cousin, she ends up making up for with regards to her intelligence. Now, this is one of the other funny things about this, because there is the classic Supergirl from before Crisis on Infinite Earths, and there's the Supergirl as we see here. In truth, we haven't really seen like an actual drag down, knockout fight between the DC Rebirth Supergirl and the DC Rebirth Superman, and so we don't really know exactly how they compare in strength, because again, this is not the new 52 Superman, this is the classic Superman that we have in DC Rebirth right now. And so because of that, if we were to take, for example, the pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths Supergirl, she'd beat the absolute crap out of DC Rebirth Superman. She would totally wreck him. That was one of the craziest things, is she's a lot stronger than he is. Well, maybe not a lot stronger, but she's definitely stronger than he is. With this version of Supergirl, we don't really know. Did DC possibly beef up her strength when she got her powers back? Because that really kind of begs the question. I mean, I would go as far as to say that before she lost her powers in the New 52, she probably wouldn't stand a chance against classic Superman. But with her powers being restored by the DEO, does that offer DC the opportunity to come back and say, well, when she got her powers back, they were amplified to some level that we weren't aware of before, and now she's stronger than she was when she first popped up in the New 52. So again, it offers a lot of different possibilities in terms of what direction she can go in and what she's capable of. But at the end of the day, you know, with her basically defeating Cyborg Superman, she's forced to realize that there is no going home. You know, that there's no way for her to go back, that she basically is stuck on Earth, and she's gonna have to get used to being here. The cool thing about this is that, again, this is sort of her just reconciling where she is and what's going on right now. Again, she's trying to figure out where she is, where she's going, all that kind of good stuff. Another thing to point out here is that following the defeat of Zor-El, Cyborg Superman, and Argo City basically crashing down into the ocean, what this does is it leads to Hank Henshaw being granted the ability to go and investigate the Argo City wreck. And so that's why this is important, is because what this does is it will allow Hank Henshaw, presumably, to discover this cybernetic, or I guess this cyborg technology, the technology of Brainiac that was used by Zor-El, which in turn would transform him into Cyborg Superman, which would lead directly into the Superman Reborn Aftermath revenge story that ends up seeing, you know, basically all of Superman's most notable villains re-emerging and facing off against him. But again, a pretty good story. I mean, I really enjoyed this. It was a pretty solid story for the inaugural DC Rebirth Supergirl line. I mean, definitely has a lot of similarities with the show, which is not a bad thing because the show is actually pretty good. So I kind of like the direction that they're going in. I hope they bolster her powers so she comes closer to the pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths Supergirl. Again, she's a lot more prominent, a lot more capable, and a lot stronger than she initially lets on. But in the end, only time will tell. So with that being said, guys, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.